When my daughter-in-law screamed at me to get out of what she thought was her house, I simply smiled and pulled out a piece of paper. The color drained from her face, and my son looked like he'd seen a ghost. You see, there are some secrets that can destroy a family in seconds, and I was about to reveal the biggest one of all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Thornfield, and at 62 years old, I thought I had seen every kind of betrayal life could offer. I was wrong. The worst was yet to come, and it would arrive wearing the face of the woman my son claimed to love. It all started on a crisp October morning, when I received a phone call that would change everything. I was in my garden, tending to the roses I had cultivated for over 30 years, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed my son's name, Theodore Thornfield. My heart always lifted when I saw his name, even though our conversations had become increasingly strained over the past 2 years. "Hello, sweetheart," I answered, brushing the soil from my gardening gloves. "Mom, we need to talk." Theodore's voice was different, colder than usual. There was an edge to it that made my stomach clench with worry. "Of course, darling. What's on your mind?" "Not over the phone. Vivienne and I are coming over this afternoon. We have something important to discuss with you." Vivienne, my daughter-in-law of 3 years. The woman who had slowly but systematically poisoned my relationship with my only child. I forced my voice to remain cheerful despite the dread creeping up my spine. "Wonderful. I'll put on some tea and bake those lemon scones you used to love." "This isn't a social visit, Mom. This is serious." The line went dead, leaving me standing in my garden with a phone in my hand and a terrible feeling in my chest. I looked around at my property, the sprawling estate that had been in the Thornfield family for 4 generations. The main house was a beautiful Victorian manor, with wraparound porches and intricate gingerbread trim. The garden stretched for acres, filled with heirloom roses, ancient oak trees, and meandering stone pathways. It was more than a home. It was a legacy. I had lived here my entire married life, raising Theodore after his father passed away when he was only 12. I had poured my heart, soul, and every penny I had into maintaining this place, not just as a home, but as an inheritance for my son. What I didn't know was that Theodore had been telling Vivienne a very different story about who actually owned what. That afternoon, I heard the familiar sound of Theodore's Mercedes pulling into the circular driveway. I smoothed my navy blue dress and checked my appearance in the hallway mirror. At 62, I still maintained myself well. My silver hair was perfectly styled, my posture straight, and my green eyes still sharp. I had learned long ago that presentation mattered, especially when dealing with people who judged others by their appearance. I opened the front door before they could knock, putting on my warmest smile. Theodore looked handsome as always in his expensive suit, his dark hair beginning to show touches of silver at the temples. But his expression was distant, almost guilty. Beside him stood Vivienne, and I had to suppress a sigh. Vivienne Thornfield was undeniably beautiful. At 28, she was tall and willowy, with platinum blonde hair that fell in perfect waves past her shoulders. Her ice blue eyes were striking, though they had never looked at me with anything approaching warmth. She was wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than most people made in a month, and her jewelry sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. Everything about her screamed money and status, which I suppose was exactly the impression she wanted to give. "Theodore, Vivienne, please come in," I said, stepping aside to let them enter. Vivienne walked past me without so much as a greeting, her high heels clicking imperiously on the hardwood floors. Theodore at least had the grace to give me a brief, awkward hug. "Mom, we should sit down for this conversation." I led them to the living room, the same room where I had read Theodore bedtime stories, where we had opened Christmas presents, where I had comforted him through his teenage heartbreaks. The irony wasn't lost on me that it would also be the room where he would break my heart. I settled into my favorite armchair, the one my late husband had bought me for our 20th anniversary. Theodore and Vivienne sat on the sofa across from me, and I noticed how Vivienne's eyes were already scanning the room with a calculating look. "So," I said, folding my hands in my lap, "what did you want to discuss?" Theodore shifted uncomfortably and glanced at his wife. Vivienne, however, had no such hesitation. She leaned forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Margaret, we've been doing a lot of thinking about the future, and we've realized that this arrangement simply isn't working anymore. What arrangement? I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I knew where this was headed. You living here, Vivienne said bluntly. In our house. I blinked, certain I had misheard. I'm sorry. What did you say? Theodore finally found his voice, though he couldn't meet my eyes. Mom, when Dad died, he left everything to me. This house. The property. All of it. I've been letting you stay here out of respect and love, but Vivienne and I are ready to start our own family. We need the space. The room seemed to spin around me. I gripped the arms of my chair to steady myself. Theodore, sweetheart, I think there's been some confusion. Your father left the house to both of us. I've been the one paying the property taxes, the insurance, the maintenance costs. I've been the one? That's not true, Vivienne interrupted sharply. Theodore has been supporting you financially for years. Haven't you, darling? Theodore nodded reluctantly. I've been covering the major expenses, Mom. You couldn't possibly afford to maintain a property this size on your pension. I stared at my son in complete shock. Theodore, that's not true. I've been paying for everything. I have the bank statements, the receipts. Mom, please don't make this harder than it needs to be, Theodore said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone I had never heard before. We know money has been tight for you since Dad died. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Vivienne nodded sympathetically, but her eyes were cold. We understand that admitting you can't afford this place might be difficult for your pride, but we're family. We want to help you transition to something more suitable for your situation. More suitable? I echoed faintly. There's a lovely senior living community about an hour from here, Vivienne continued brightly. Garden View Estates. It's very affordable, and they have bingo nights twice a week. You'd love it there. I felt as though I was in some kind of nightmare. These people, sitting in my living room, in my house, were calmly telling me that I needed to move to a senior home because I couldn't afford to live in my own property. I think there's been a serious misunderstanding, I said slowly. Theodore, do you remember when your father died? Do you remember the will reading? Theodore looked uncomfortable again. Mom, that was 15 years ago. And honestly, you were so grief-stricken, I'm not sure you remember everything clearly. I remember perfectly well, I said firmly. The house was left to both of us, with the understanding that I would live here for the rest of my life. You inherited the investment properties and the business assets. Vivienne let out a small laugh. Margaret, I think you might be confused. Theodore owns this entire estate. He's been gracious enough to let you stay here, but we really do need you to make other arrangements. I looked back and forth between them, trying to understand how this could be happening. My own son was sitting in my living room, lying to my face about something as fundamental as who owned the house we were sitting in. Theodore, I said quietly, are you telling me you believe you own this house? I don't believe it, Mom. I know it. I have the deed. You have a deed? Of course I do. Vivienne helped me get all the paperwork organized when we got married. It's all very clear. I felt a chill run down my spine. What exactly did Vivienne help you organize? Vivienne smiled again, and this time there was something almost predatory about it. I helped Theodore understand his financial situation and his assets. It's amazing how much paperwork can pile up over the years. We found the original deed in his father's safe, and it clearly shows that Theodore inherited everything. His father's safe? I repeated. Theodore, you don't have access to your father's safe. I'm the only one with the combination. Actually, Mom, I had a locksmith open it last year when you were visiting Aunt Helena for her birthday. We needed to get all the important documents together for our financial planning. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. While I was away visiting my sister, my son had broken into his father's safe and stolen documents. But more than that, He was lying about what those documents said.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Theodore, I want to see this deed you're referring to. Vivienne reached into her designer purse and pulled out a folder. Of course. We brought copies for you to review. She handed me several sheets of paper with a triumphant expression. I looked down at the documents, and my blood ran cold. They appeared to be official property deeds, clearly stating that Theodore Thornfield was the sole owner of the estate. The paperwork looked legitimate, with all the proper seals and signatures, but I knew they were forgeries. These documents are fake, I said quietly. Vivienne gasped dramatically. Excuse me? Are you accusing us of forging legal documents? I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm stating a fact. These are not the real property deeds. Theodore stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. Mom, I can't believe you're calling me a liar. I would never forge anything. These documents came directly from Dad's safe. Then explain to me how these documents show you as the sole owner when I was present at the will reading and I know exactly what your father left to whom. Vivienne also stood, her facade of sweetness finally dropping completely. Margaret, I think your memory isn't as reliable as you think it is. Grief can do terrible things to a person's recollection of events. My memory is perfectly fine, thank you. Is it, though? Vivienne's voice turned sharp and cutting. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been living in denial for 15 years. This house is far too expensive for someone in your situation to maintain. Theodore has been quietly covering the costs to spare your feelings, but we simply can't continue this charade any longer. I looked at my son, searching his face for any sign of the loving boy I had raised. Theodore, do you really believe what you're saying? Do you honestly think I've been living here as some kind of charity case for 15 years? Theodore wouldn't meet my eyes. Mom, I know this is hard to accept, but it's the truth. You've been struggling financially, and I've been helping. But Vivienne and I have our own lives to think about now. We want to start a family, Vivienne added, placing a possessive hand on Theodore's arm. We need the master bedroom for ourselves, and we'll need the other bedrooms for children. There simply isn't room for 3 generations in one house. There are 12 bedrooms in this house, I said incredulously. Yes, but most of them need updating, and that's expensive. We'd rather focus our resources on the bedrooms we'll actually use. I realized in that moment that I was dealing with people who had convinced themselves of a completely fabricated version of reality. Whether Theodore truly believed what he was saying, or whether he was consciously lying, I couldn't tell. But Vivienne, I was certain, knew exactly what she was doing. I need some time to process this, I said finally. Of course, Vivienne said graciously. We're not unreasonable. We'll give you 30 days to make arrangements. 30 days? That should be plenty of time to find a nice apartment or get into that senior community I mentioned. Theodore and I are planning to move in officially at the end of next month. Move in? You already live here. We live in the guest wing, Theodore said, but we want to move into the main part of the house. We want to make it our own. I looked around the living room, at the family photos on the mantelpiece, at the antique furniture that had been passed down through generations, at the Persian rug my grandmother had bought in 1923. They wanted to make it their own. And what about all of my belongings, my furniture, my personal items? Vivienne waved her hand dismissively. Oh, you can take whatever you can fit in your new place. The rest we'll either keep if it fits our style or donate to charity. Don't worry, we'll handle all of that for you. They were going to donate my family heirlooms to charity. I think you should both leave now, I said quietly. Theodore looked surprised. Mom, we're just trying to help you understand the situation. I understand perfectly. You've made your position very clear. Now I'd like you to leave so I can think about everything you've told me. Vivienne smiled again, clearly pleased with how the conversation had gone. Of course, Margaret. Take all the time you need. We'll check in with you in a few days to see how your apartment hunting is going. They walked toward the front door, Vivienne's heels clicking triumphantly on the hardwood floors. At the doorway, Theodore turned back to me with what I suppose he thought was a concerned expression. "Mom, I know this is a big adjustment, but it's for the best. You'll be much happier in a place that's more manageable." "I'm sure I will be," I replied evenly. After they left, I sat in my living room for a long time, staring at the fake documents Vivienne had left behind. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting familiar shadows across the room. I had sat in this same spot thousands of times over the years, but it had never felt quite like this. I wasn't angry yet. I was still too shocked for anger. But I was beginning to formulate a plan. You see, there was something Vivienne didn't know about me. Something Theodore had apparently forgotten in all his eagerness to please his new wife. I wasn't just some helpless widow living on a pension. I wasn't just some confused old woman who couldn't manage her own affairs. I was Margaret Elizabeth Thornfield, and I had been managing this estate, these investments, and this family's finances since before Vivienne was even born. I had built a considerable portfolio over the years, partially through careful investing, and partially through my late husband's insurance policies and business interests. I had more money than Theodore realized, and I certainly had more than enough to maintain this property. But more importantly, I had something that would prove once and for all who really owned this house. Something that would wipe that smug smile off Vivienne's face and show Theodore exactly what kind of woman he had married. I walked to my bedroom and opened the antique armoire that had belonged to my great-grandmother. Hidden behind the false back panel was a small safe, one that neither Theodore nor Vivienne knew existed. Inside that safe were the real property deeds, the ones that clearly showed my name as the primary owner of the estate, with Theodore listed as a secondary beneficiary who would inherit only upon my death. I also had copies of every bank statement, every tax payment, every insurance premium, and every maintenance expense I had paid over the past 15 years. I had meticulous records that would prove beyond any doubt that I had been the one supporting this property, not Theodore. But I wasn't going to reveal any of this just yet. If Vivienne wanted to play games, I was more than happy to play along. I had 30 days, according to her generous timeline, and I intended to use every single one of them. The next morning, I called my attorney, Harrison Walsh, a man who had been handling the Thornfield family legal affairs for over 20 years. I made an appointment to see him that afternoon, and I brought copies of the forged documents Vivienne had given me. Harrison was a distinguished man in his 70s, with silver hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He had known my family since Theodore was a child, and he was not easily fooled. "Margaret," he said after reviewing the papers, "these documents are completely fraudulent. The signatures are wrong, the notary seals are fake, and the legal language is incorrect. Whoever created these did a terrible job. I suspected as much. The question is, what should I do about it?" Harrison leaned back in his leather chair and studied me carefully. "Well, the obvious answer is to confront them with the real documents and put an end to this nonsense immediately. That's the obvious answer, yes. But is it the best answer?" Harrison raised an eyebrow. "What do you have in mind?" "I want to see how far they're willing to take this. I want to know exactly what Vivienne's plan is, and whether Theodore is a willing participant or just a fool being manipulated." "Margaret, that could be dangerous. If they're willing to forge legal documents, there's no telling what else they might do." "Harrison, I've been dealing with difficult people my entire life. I think I can handle one spoiled young woman and my confused son. What if they try to have you declared incompetent? What if they claim you're suffering from dementia or some other condition that affects your judgment? I hadn't considered that possibility, but it didn't frighten me. Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. In the meantime, I want you to prepare a comprehensive file of all the real documents, the authentic property deeds, all the financial records, everything that proves my ownership and my competency. And you want me to keep this file secure until you're ready to use it?" "Exactly. Think of it as insurance." Harrison agreed to my plan, though he clearly had reservations. He prepared everything I had requested and stored it in his office safe. He also advised me to document everything that happened over the next 30 days. just in case we needed evidence of harassment or fraud. I returned home that evening feeling more confident than I had since the whole ordeal began. I had a plan, I had legal backing, and I had the truth on my side. All I had to do was wait and see what Vivienne's next move would be. I didn't have to wait long. The next day, I found Vivienne in my kitchen, going through my cabinets and making notes on a legal pad. She was wearing another expensive outfit, this time a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a sleek chignon, and she was wearing the kind of jewelry that suggested serious money. "Good morning, Margaret," she said brightly when she saw me. "I hope you don't mind, but I wanted to start getting a sense of what we'll need to do to update this space." "Update this space?" "Oh yes, this kitchen is terribly outdated. We'll need to gut the whole thing and start over. Stainless steel appliances, granite countertops, maybe a nice island in the center. It'll be gorgeous when we're finished." I looked around my kitchen, which I had renovated just 5 years earlier. The cabinets were solid cherry wood, the countertops were beautiful butcher block, and the appliances were all high-end models. It was a warm, welcoming space that had been the heart of my home for decades. "I wasn't aware you had decided to renovate." "Well, if we're going to be living here full-time, we need to make some changes. This whole house needs updating, really. The decor is very..." She paused, clearly searching for a polite way to say what she was thinking. "Very dated." "I see. And you're planning to pay for these renovations yourself?" Vivienne laughed, a tinkling sound that somehow managed to be both musical and grating. "Margaret, we'll be paying for everything once you move out. The house will be ours, so naturally the renovation costs will be our responsibility." "Of course. How silly of me." I watched as she continued making notes, occasionally opening cabinets and examining their contents with obvious distaste. She picked up a mixing bowl that had been my mother's and examined it like it was contaminated. "Most of this kitchen equipment will have to go," she said, more to herself than to me. "I prefer a minimalist aesthetic. Too much clutter makes a space feel small and cramped." That mixing bowl had made thousands of batches of cookies, countless birthday cakes and holiday pies. It had fed 3 generations of Thornfields, and Vivienne was dismissing it as clutter. "Vivienne, may I ask you something?" "Of course." She looked up from her notepad with an expression of polite attention. "What exactly do you think Theodore's financial situation is?" "What do you mean?" "Well, renovating a house this size would be enormously expensive. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, easily. I'm just wondering where you think that money will come from." Vivienne's smile became a bit strained. "Theodore is very successful. He makes an excellent living. He does well for himself, certainly. But I'm not sure his income would support the kind of renovations you're describing, plus raising a family, plus all the normal expenses of maintaining an estate this size." "Margaret, I think you might be underestimating Theodore's success. He's been promoted twice in the last 3 years. Yes, I'm very proud of him, but even with his promotions, his salary is probably around $200,000 a year. That's excellent money, but it wouldn't go very far on a property like this." Vivienne's pen stopped moving, and she looked at me with a sharp expression. "How do you know how much Theodore makes?" "He's my son. We talk about his career." "Well, maybe his salary isn't his only source of income. Maybe he has investments, or savings, or other assets you don't know about. Maybe he does. I'm just curious because maintaining this house costs about $8,000 a month, just in basic expenses. Property taxes, insurance, utilities, maintenance, groundskeeping. That's nearly $100,000 a year before you even think about renovations or improvements." I could see Vivienne doing the math in her head, and I could tell she didn't like the numbers she was coming up with. "Theodore must have a plan," she said finally. "He wouldn't have asked you to move out if he couldn't afford to maintain the property." "You're probably right. I'm sure he's thought it all through very carefully." But I could see doubt creeping into her eyes. For the first time since this whole thing started, Vivienne looked uncertain. "I should probably get going," she said, closing her notepad. "I have a lunch appointment in town." "Of course. Don't let me keep you." After she left, I allowed myself a small smile. The first crack in Vivienne's confidence had appeared, and I hadn't even had to lie. I had simply presented her with the financial reality of what she was trying to take on. That evening, Theodore called me. "Mom, Vivienne said you were asking questions about my finances today. I was just curious about how you plan to afford the renovations she's talking about." There was a long pause. "What renovations?" "The kitchen, for starters. Vivienne seems to think it needs to be completely gutted and redone." Another pause. "She didn't mention any renovations to me." "Oh. Well, perhaps she wanted it to be a surprise." "Mom, exactly how much does it cost to maintain the house?" Here it was, the question I had been waiting for. "Well, Theodore, that depends on what you mean by maintain. Basic expenses, or including improvements and repairs?" "Basic expenses. Around $8,000 a month, give or take." $8,000? Every month? Property taxes alone are $3,000 a month. Insurance is another $1,500. Utilities run about $1,000, sometimes more in winter. Then there's lawn service, house cleaning, pool maintenance, security system, regular repairs, and upkeep. It adds up quickly. Theodore was quiet for so long, I thought the call had dropped. "Theodore, are you still there?" "Yeah, I'm here. I didn't realize it was quite that much." "It's a large property, sweetheart. Large properties are expensive to maintain. How have you been affording it all these years?" And there it was, the moment of truth. I could tell him right now that I had been paying for everything myself, that I had never needed his financial support, that the entire premise of their argument was false. But I wasn't ready to play that card yet. "It's been challenging," I said simply, "but I've managed. Mom, if money has been tight, why didn't you ever ask me for help?" "Theodore, you have your own life to think about. I didn't want to be a burden." I could practically hear him struggling with this new information. His wife had convinced him that he owned this house and that he could afford to maintain it. Now he was learning that maintaining it would eat up nearly half his annual salary. "Mom, I need to think about all of this. Can we talk again tomorrow?" "Of course, sweetheart. Take all the time you need." After I hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my back porch, looking out over the gardens I had tended for so many years. The sun was setting, casting everything in a golden glow, and I could hear the gentle sound of the fountain in the rose garden. This was my home. This was my sanctuary. And I wasn't going to let anyone take it away from me without a fight. But more than that, I was beginning to see the real scope of what Vivienne had done. She hadn't just convinced Theodore that he owned the house. She had convinced him that he could afford to maintain it, that he could support her expensive lifestyle, and that getting rid of me was the key to their financial freedom. She was about to learn that Margaret Thornfield was not the helpless old woman she thought she was dealing with. And when that lesson came, it was going to be thorough, public, and absolutely devastating. The game was just beginning. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of increasingly bizarre encounters. Vivienne had apparently decided that, since I was moving out anyway, she might as well start treating the house as her own personal domain. I would find her rearranging furniture, measuring rooms, and even going through my personal belongings with the casual entitlement of someone who believed she owned everything she touched. On Tuesday morning, I discovered her in my study, rifling through the antique desk that had belonged to my grandfather. She had papers spread across the surface and was photographing documents with her phone. "Vivienne, what are you doing?" She looked up with that practiced smile of hers, completely unashamed to have been caught going through my private papers. "Oh, Margaret, perfect timing." "I was just trying to get organized for the estate sale." "Estate sale?" "Well, yes. We'll need to sell most of this furniture before you move. A lot of these pieces are quite valuable, and the proceeds will help cover your moving expenses and the first few months at Garden View Estates." I stared at her in disbelief. "You're planning to sell my furniture to pay for my living expenses?" "Don't think of it as selling your furniture. Think of it as liquidating assets that you can't take with you anyway. It's really quite practical when you think about it." She held up a photograph she had taken of an ornate silver letter opener. "This piece alone should bring in a few $100s. And that grandfather clock in the hallway? I've had it appraised, and it's worth at least $15,000. You've had my grandfather clock appraised? I wanted to make sure we got fair market value for everything. I've actually been working with an estate sale company for the past week. They're very professional, and they handle everything from pricing to advertising to cleanup. My hands were shaking with rage, but I kept my voice level. How thoughtful of you to handle all the details. I know it must be overwhelming for you to think about parting with so many possessions. That's why I wanted to take care of as much as possible. You shouldn't have to worry about these practical matters during such an emotional time. The condescension in her tone was breathtaking. She was sitting in my study, photographing my belongings for an estate sale, and somehow managing to frame it as an act of kindness. Have you discussed this estate sale with Theodore? For the first time, Vivienne looked slightly uncomfortable. Theodore has been very busy with work lately. I didn't want to burden him with all these details. I see. So this was entirely your idea? Well, someone needs to handle the practical aspects. Theodore is wonderful, but he's not really equipped to deal with this kind of thing. He gets too emotional when it comes to family matters. I walked over to the desk and began gathering up the papers she had scattered across its surface. Among them, I noticed several official-looking documents that I didn't recognize. What are these? I asked, holding up what appeared to be insurance forms. Oh, those are just some paperwork I've been handling. Property insurance, that sort of thing. Very boring stuff. I looked more closely at the documents and felt my blood pressure spike. They were applications to change the beneficiary on the homeowner's insurance policy from me to Theodore and Vivienne jointly. Vivienne, these are insurance beneficiary changes. Yes, well, since the property is going to be ours, it makes sense to update the insurance information, don't you think? You're trying to change insurance policies on a house you don't own. Her smile faltered for just a moment. Margaret, I think you're still confused about the ownership situation. These are just routine administrative updates. I folded the documents and slipped them into my pocket. I'll hang on to these for now. Actually, I need those back. They have to be filed by Friday. I'm sure they do. I smiled at her with the same saccharine sweetness she had been using on me. But I think I'll review them with my attorney first, just to make sure everything is in order. The mention of an attorney made Vivienne's eye twitch slightly. Your attorney? Margaret, I hope you're not planning to fight this. That would be very expensive for you, and frankly, it would be futile. The ownership documentation is very clear. Oh, I'm sure it is. I just like to be thorough about these things. I left her sitting in my study and went directly to my bedroom to call Harrison Walsh. When I described what I had found, he was silent for a long moment. Margaret, she's committed multiple crimes just in what you've described today. Attempted insurance fraud, theft, trespassing. If she's been doing this kind of thing for weeks, we probably have enough evidence to press charges. Not yet, Harrison. I want to see how far she's willing to go. This is getting dangerous. What if she tries to forge your signature on those insurance documents? Then we'll have her for forgery as well as fraud. Margaret, I'm beginning to think you're enjoying this too much. He wasn't wrong. After weeks of being treated like a confused old woman who couldn't manage her own affairs, I was finding a certain satisfaction in watching Vivienne dig herself deeper and deeper into a hole of her own making. That afternoon, I decided to do a little investigating of my own. If Vivienne was comfortable going through my belongings, I figured I could return the favor. Theodore and Vivienne lived in the guest wing of the house, which had its own separate entrance but was connected to the main house through a covered walkway. I waited until I saw Vivienne's car leave the driveway, then let myself into their living space with the master key I had never bothered to mention I possessed. What I found there was illuminating. Their apartment was decorated in the kind of sterile, expensive style that looked like it came straight from a high-end furniture showroom. Everything was white or gray or chrome, with no personal touches or warmth. It looked like a hotel suite rather than a home. But what really caught my attention was the stack of credit card statements on their dining room table. I couldn't help but notice that they were opened and spread out, as if someone had been reviewing them carefully. Without touching anything, I could see enough to understand why Vivienne might be so eager to get her hands on a valuable property. The balances were staggering. Between the two of them, they appeared to owe more than $200,000 in credit card debt. There were statements from high-end department stores, luxury travel companies, jewelry stores, and exclusive restaurants. It looked like they had been living far beyond their means for quite some time. I also spotted what appeared to be a loan application on the table, though I couldn't read the details without moving the papers. But the presence of such a document suggested that they were actively seeking additional financing for something. I left everything exactly as I had found it and returned to the main house. The picture was becoming clearer. Vivienne hadn't married Theodore because she loved him. She had married him because she thought he came with a valuable estate and a comfortable lifestyle. When she discovered that maintaining that lifestyle was expensive, she had come up with a plan to get rid of the current owner and claim the property for herself. The problem was, her plan was based on completely false information about who owned what and who could afford what. That evening, Theodore called again. He sounded stressed and tired. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I have some questions." "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" "Well, if it really costs $8,000 a month to maintain the house, how have you been managing that on your pension?" This was the opening I had been waiting for. "Theodore, I think there might be some confusion about my financial situation." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm not living on just a pension. I have other sources of income." There was a long pause. "What other sources of income?" "Well, your father left me more than just half the house. He also left me his investment portfolio, his life insurance proceeds, and his share of the business he owned with his partners. I've been managing those assets for the past 15 years. What? Mom, I thought Dad's investments and insurance went to me. Some of them did. But the majority came to me, with the understanding that I would use them to maintain our standard of living and preserve the estate for future generations. How much money are we talking about?" I took a deep breath. "Theodore, I'm not comfortable discussing specific numbers over the phone, but I will say that I have been entirely self-sufficient since your father died. I have never needed financial assistance from anyone." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I began to wonder if he had hung up. "Theodore? I'm here. I'm just trying to understand. If you have money, why did Vivienne think you were struggling financially? I have no idea where Vivienne got that impression. Did you tell her I was struggling?" I don't think so. She just seemed to know that you were having a hard time managing expenses." "Well, she was mistaken." "But Mom, if you can afford to maintain the house, then why were you willing to move out?" Now we were getting to the heart of the matter. "Theodore, I was willing to consider moving because you and Vivienne told me this was your house and that I had been living here as a guest for 15 years. If that were true, then naturally I would respect your wishes and find somewhere else to live." "But you don't think it's true?" "Theodore, I know it's not true. I have the original property deeds, the will, and 15 years of financial records. I know exactly who owns this house and who has been paying to maintain it." The silence this time was even longer. "Mom, I think I need to see those documents." "I think that would be a very good idea. Can we meet tomorrow? Without Vivienne? I think I need to understand this situation better." "Of course. Why don't you come for lunch? We can talk through everything calmly and privately." After I hung up, I realized that the end game was approaching faster than I had anticipated. Theodore was starting to ask the right questions, which meant Vivienne's carefully constructed house of cards was beginning to wobble. The next morning, I prepared a light lunch and laid out copies of all the relevant documents on the dining room table. The original will, the property deeds, bank statements showing my payments for taxes and insurance, investment account statements showing my assets, and a detailed breakdown of every expense I had paid over the past 15 years. Theodore arrived precisely at noon, looking haggard and anxious. He had dark circles under his eyes, and his usually impeccable appearance was slightly disheveled. "Mom, before we start, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. Do you think Vivienne has been lying to me?" The question caught me off guard with its directness. I had expected to have to lead him gradually to that conclusion. "Theodore, what do you think?" He ran his hands through his hair and slumped into a chair. "I don't know what to think anymore. Last night, after we talked, I went home and asked Vivienne where she got the information about your financial situation. She said you had told her yourself that you were struggling to make ends meet. When did I supposedly tell her this? According to her, it was during one of your conversations shortly after we got married. She said you had confided in her that the expenses were overwhelming and that you were worried about losing the house. I stared at my son. Theodore, Vivienne and I have never had a conversation like that. In fact, Vivienne and I have barely had any substantive conversations at all. She's never shown the slightest interest in my financial situation until recently. That's what I was afraid you'd say. Why were you afraid? Because it means she's been lying to me for 3 years. Theodore looked so defeated that my heart went out to him despite everything that had happened. Sweetheart, what else has she told you about me or about the house? She said you had asked her to help you organize your finances because you were confused about all the paperwork. She said you had given her permission to look through Dad's safe to help sort out the estate documents. Theodore, I've never asked Vivienne for help with anything, and I certainly never gave her permission to go through your father's safe. She also said you had mentioned wanting to move to a smaller place because this house was too much for you to handle. When did I supposedly say that? Last Christmas, apparently. She said you brought it up during dinner and that you seemed relieved when she offered to help you find somewhere more suitable. I remembered Christmas dinner very clearly. Vivienne had spent the entire meal criticizing everything from the food to the decorations to the antique china we were eating from. The only thing she had said about my living situation was a snide comment about how much work it must be to keep such an old house clean. Theodore, none of that is true. None of it. He nodded slowly. I was afraid of that too. How long have you suspected she was lying? I think part of me has known for a while, but I didn't want to believe it. It's easier to go along with what someone tells you than to face the fact that you've married someone who would manipulate you like this. I reached across the table and took his hand. Theodore, manipulation in a marriage is serious. This isn't just about the house. I know. And it's not just about the house, Mom. She's been controlling our finances, our social life, even my relationship with you. I just never realized how bad it had gotten until now. What do you mean about your finances? Theodore's face darkened. She's been spending money we don't have. Credit cards, personal loans, expensive purchases that we can't afford. When I ask her about it, she always has an explanation for why it was necessary or why it was a good investment. How much debt are you carrying? I don't even know anymore. She handles all the bills and the credit card payments. Every time I try to get involved, she tells me I'm being controlling and that she has everything under control. I thought about the credit card statements I had seen in their apartment. Theodore, I think you need to get copies of all your financial statements and review them carefully. I've been trying to do that, but she keeps putting me off. She says there's no need for me to worry about the details as long as the bills are getting paid. Are the bills getting paid? I thought they were, but lately I've been getting calls from credit card companies and collection agencies. When I ask Vivienne about it, she says they're just routine calls, and that she'll handle everything. The scope of the deception was becoming clear. Vivienne hadn't just lied about the house and my financial situation. She had been systematically taking control of Theodore's entire life, isolating him from me, and apparently spending them both into serious debt. Theodore, I want you to look at these documents. I pushed the stack of papers across the table to him. These are the real property deeds, the real will, and the real financial records. I want you to see the truth for yourself. He spent the next hour reviewing everything I had laid out for him. I watched his expression change from confusion to shock to anger as the reality of the situation became clear. Mom, according to these documents, you own this house outright. There's no mortgage, no liens, nothing. And these bank statements show that you've been paying every single expense for the past 15 years. That's correct. And these investment statements show that you have more money than I thought was possible. I smiled. Your father was a very smart investor, and I've been fortunate enough to build on what he left me. Theodore looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen since he was a child. Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry for everything I said to you, for believing her lies, for treating you like you were some kind of burden. Theodore, you were deceived by someone you trusted. That's not your fault. It is my fault, though. I should have questioned her story. I should have asked to see documentation. I should have talked to you directly instead of just accepting what she told me. What matters now is what you do with this information. Theodore was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the documents spread across the table. I need to confront her. I need to ask her to explain herself. Are you prepared for what that conversation might reveal? I think I already know what it's going to reveal. The question is whether I'm strong enough to deal with it. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw something I hadn't seen in years. The confusion and defensiveness were gone, replaced by a clarity that reminded me of the boy I had raised. Theodore, you're stronger than you think you are. You're a good man who was taken advantage of by someone who saw an opportunity and exploited it. She saw me as a meal ticket. It appears that way, yes. And when she realized that the meal ticket wasn't as valuable as she thought, she decided to try to steal the restaurant. Despite everything, I had to smile at the analogy. That's one way to put it. Theodore gathered up the documents and handed them back to me. Mom, I want you to know that I never intended for any of this to happen. I love you, and I would never want to hurt you or take away your home. I know that, sweetheart. What I don't understand is how I let myself get so far off track. How did I become the kind of person who would believe such terrible things about his own mother? Theodore, manipulation is insidious. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually, one small lie building on another, until you find yourself living in a completely false reality. How long do you think she's been planning this? I don't know, but based on what I've observed, I think she's been working toward this goal for quite some time. Theodore stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens that stretched beyond the house. I'm going to have to divorce her, aren't I? That's not a decision I can make for you. But you think I should. I think you should do whatever you need to do to protect yourself and your future. Someone who would forge legal documents and attempt insurance fraud is not someone you can trust with your life or your financial security. She forged legal documents? I had forgotten that Theodore didn't know about the fake deeds Vivienne had shown me. I quickly explained about the fraudulent property documents and the insurance beneficiary changes she had been attempting. Theodore's face went pale. She could go to prison for that. Yes, she could. Mom, what are you going to do about all of this? That was the question I had been asking myself for weeks. I had evidence of multiple crimes, I had the truth on my side, and I had the resources to pursue legal action. But I also had a son who was going to be hurt no matter how this ended. I'm going to give you a chance to handle this privately first. If you can convince Vivienne to admit what she's done and to leave peacefully, then perhaps we can avoid involving law enforcement. And if she won't admit anything or agree to leave, then I'll do whatever is necessary to protect my home and my family. Theodore nodded slowly. I understand. And Mom, whatever happens, I want you to know that I support you completely. This is your house. It's always been your house, and no one has the right to try to take it away from you. After Theodore left, I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that my son had finally seen the truth, but apprehension about what would happen when he confronted Vivienne with that truth. I didn't have to wait long to find out. At around 9 o'clock that evening, I heard shouting coming from the guest wing. The voices were muffled by distance and walls, but the anger was unmistakable. The argument went on for over an hour, with periods of silence followed by renewed shouting. Finally, around 10:30, I heard a car door slam and an engine start. Through my bedroom window, I could see Vivienne's white BMW speeding down the driveway and disappearing into the night. About 20 minutes later, there was a soft knock on my front door. I found Theodore standing on my porch, looking exhausted and defeated. She's gone, he said simply. Gone where? I don't know. She packed a bag and left. She said she was going to stay with a friend while she figured out what to do next. How did she react when you showed her the real documents? Theodore laughed bitterly. She denied everything at first. Said the documents you showed me were fake, that you were the one who was lying. When I pointed out that your documents had authentic notary seals and official stamps, while hers looked like they had been created on a computer, she changed tactics. What did she say then? She said that even if the documents were real, it didn't matter because you were an old woman who couldn't possibly manage a property this size on your own. She said you needed someone to take care of you whether you admitted it or not. And when you told her about my financial situation, that's when she really lost it. She accused you of hiding money from the family, of being selfish and manipulative. She said you had been lying to everyone about your capabilities and that you were probably suffering from early dementia. I felt a chill at those words. Accusations of mental incompetence were exactly what Harrison had warned me about. Did you believe her? Of course not. But Mom, I think she might try to pursue that angle. When people are desperate, they do desperate things. What do you think she'll do next? Theodore sat down heavily in one of the porch chairs. I honestly don't know. She's not the person I thought I married. I'm not sure I ever really knew her at all. Theodore, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Okay. Do you think Vivienne might try to hurt me? Physically, I mean. Theodore was quiet for a long moment. A week ago, I would have said absolutely not. But after tonight, after seeing how she reacted when her plan fell apart, I'm not sure what she's capable of. Then I think it's time to involve the authorities. Are you sure? Once we call the police, there's no going back. This becomes a criminal matter. Theodore, she's already made it a criminal matter. The forgery, the attempted fraud, the theft of documents from your father's safe. These aren't civil disputes. These are crimes. I know. And I know she needs to face consequences for what she's done. I just hate that it's come to this. I hate it too, sweetheart. But sometimes protecting yourself requires doing things you'd rather not do. Theodore nodded. What do you need me to do? I need you to go through your apartment and gather up any evidence of what she's been doing. Credit card statements, loan applications, anything that shows the financial deception. I also need you to write down everything you can remember about the lies she told you, with dates if possible. And then we call Harrison Walsh and ask him to arrange a meeting with the district attorney's office. Mom, before we do this, I want you to know how sorry I am. Not just for believing her lies, but for letting our relationship deteriorate the way it did. I should have been a better son. I reached over and took his hand. Theodore, you are a good son who found himself in a bad situation. The important thing is that you recognized the truth when you saw it, and you chose to do the right thing. I love you, Mom. I love you too, sweetheart. As I watched Theodore walk back to the guest wing to gather evidence against his wife, I reflected on how dramatically things had changed in just a few hours. This morning, I had been a woman facing eviction from her own home by her own family. Tonight, I was a homeowner preparing to prosecute someone for attempting to steal her property. But more importantly, I had my son back. The real Theodore. The one I had raised. The one who would choose truth over convenience and family over personal gain. Whatever happened with Vivienne, that relationship had been restored, and that was worth more to me than any house or any amount of money. Still, I wasn't naive enough to think this was over. Vivienne had invested too much time and energy in her scheme to give up easily. And if Theodore was right about her desperation, she might try something even more dangerous than forged documents and insurance fraud. I made sure all the doors and windows were locked before I went to bed that night, and for the first time in years, I set the security alarm that I had installed but rarely used. Tomorrow, we would begin the process of making sure Vivienne Thornfield faced the consequences of her actions. But tonight, I was going to sleep peacefully in my own home, in my own bed, knowing that no one was going to take it away from me. The next morning brought an unexpected development. I was having coffee on my back porch when I saw a police car pull into my driveway. For a moment, I wondered if Theodore had already contacted the authorities. But when I saw the officer's expression, I realized this wasn't a friendly visit. The officer was a young woman with short brown hair and a serious demeanor. She introduced herself as Officer Patricia Chen and asked if she could speak with me about a complaint that had been filed. What kind of complaint? I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew. A complaint alleging elder abuse and financial exploitation. The complainant claims that you're being taken advantage of by family members who are stealing your money and trying to force you out of your home. My heart sank. Vivienne had gotten there first. Officer Chen, I think there's been a misunderstanding. No one is taking advantage of me or stealing my money. Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions to determine your safety and well-being. Is that all right? Of course. Officer Chen spent the next hour asking me detailed questions about my living situation, my finances, my relationship with Theodore, and my mental and physical health. I answered everything honestly and thoroughly, and I could see her initial concern beginning to fade as it became clear that I was perfectly competent and not being exploited by anyone. Mrs. Thornfield, based on our conversation, it appears that you're managing your affairs quite well. However, the person who filed this complaint was very insistent that you were in danger. She claimed to have documentation showing that family members have been forging your signature and stealing your money. Officer Chen, may I ask who filed this complaint? A Mrs. Vivienne Thornfield. She said she was your daughter-in-law and that she was concerned about your welfare. Vivienne is indeed my daughter-in-law, but I think her concern may be misplaced. In fact, I was planning to contact the police myself today about some issues involving Mrs. Vivienne Thornfield. Officer Chen's eyebrows went up. What kind of issues? I explained the entire situation, from the forged property deeds to the attempted insurance fraud to the theft of documents from my late husband's safe. I showed her copies of all the evidence I had gathered, and I could see her expression change from skepticism to serious concern. Mrs. Thornfield, these are serious criminal allegations. Have you spoken with an attorney about this situation? Yes, I have legal representation. We were planning to contact the district attorney's office today. I think that's an excellent idea. In the meantime, I'm going to file a report about what you've told me, and I'm going to recommend that the elder abuse complaint be dismissed as unfounded. Thank you, Officer Chen. Mrs. Thornfield, I have to ask, do you feel safe in your home? Are you concerned that Mrs. Vivienne Thornfield might try to harm you or intimidate you? It was a question I had been trying not to think about, but I had to face it honestly. I'm not sure. Yesterday, she was convinced she was going to inherit this property and live here permanently. Today, she knows that her plan has been exposed and that she could face criminal charges. I don't know how she might react to that. Would you like us to increase patrols in your neighborhood for the next few days? That would be very reassuring, thank you. After Officer Chen left, I called Harrison Walsh and told him about Vivienne's preemptive strike with the elder abuse complaint. Margaret, this is exactly what I was worried about. She's trying to get ahead of the story and paint herself as the concerned family member trying to protect you. But the officer saw right through it. This officer did, yes, but Vivienne might try this approach with other agencies or other officials. Adult Protective Services, the court system, even your bank or investment firm. You need to be prepared for the possibility that she'll try to have you declared incompetent. Can she do that? She can try. It would be very difficult to prove, especially given your obvious competency and the evidence we have of your sound financial management. But the process itself can be disruptive and stressful. What do you recommend? I recommend we move quickly to file criminal charges against her. Once she's facing prosecution for fraud and forgery, her credibility as a concerned family member will be seriously undermined. All right, what do we need to do? I'm going to call the district attorney's office this afternoon and request an emergency meeting. I'll ask Theodore to join us with all the evidence he's gathered. The sooner we get this in front of a prosecutor, the better. That afternoon, Theodore, Harrison, and I met with Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Morrison, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who specialized in white-collar crimes. We laid out the entire case for her, complete with copies of all the forged documents, financial records, and witness statements. Ms. Morrison reviewed everything carefully, asking pointed questions about timelines, evidence, and potential defenses Vivienne might raise. This is a solid case, she said finally. We have clear evidence of forgery, attempted fraud, theft, and conspiracy. The only question is whether we can locate Mrs. Thornfield to serve her with the charges. She's probably staying with friends, Theodore said. I can try to find out where. That would be helpful. In the meantime, I'm going to prepare arrest warrants for multiple felony charges. Mrs. Thornfield is going to find herself in very serious legal trouble. What about the elder abuse complaint she filed? I asked. I'll contact the investigating agency and let them know that this appears to be a case of the accused trying to discredit the victim. That complaint will be dismissed. As we left the district attorney's office, I felt a sense of relief mixed with sadness. Relief that justice would be served, but sadness that it had come to this. A year ago, Theodore had been happily married, and I had been hopeful that Vivienne might eventually warm up to me. Now she was facing felony charges, and Theodore's marriage was over. "Mom," Theodore said as we stood in the parking lot, "I want you to know that whatever happens from here, I'm grateful that you gave me the chance to see the truth and do the right thing." "Theodore, you didn't need me to give you that chance. You took it yourself when you chose to ask the hard questions." "I should have asked them sooner." "Maybe, but you asked them when it mattered, and that's what counts." That evening, as I sat in my living room reading a book, I reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. The house felt peaceful again, the way it had before Vivienne had started treating it as her personal domain. The family photos on the mantelpiece seemed to smile down at me with approval, as if the generations of Thornfields who had lived here before me were relieved that their legacy was secure. But I knew this wasn't quite over yet. Vivienne was still out there somewhere, probably planning her next move. And while I had faith in the legal system, I also knew that desperate people sometimes did unpredictable things. I made sure the security system was armed and the doors were locked. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight I was safe in my own home, surrounded by my own belongings, secure in the knowledge that no one could take any of it away from me. The deed to this house bore my name, and it always had. Vivienne could forge as many fake documents as she wanted, but she couldn't change the fundamental truth of ownership. This was my home, it had always been my home, and it would remain my home until I decided otherwise, and that decision would be mine alone to make. 3 days later, I was awakened at 6 a.m. by the sound of multiple car doors slamming in my driveway. I looked out my bedroom window and saw 2 police cars, a black sedan, and what appeared to be a moving truck. My heart started racing as I watched several people in uniform walking toward my front door. The doorbell rang insistently, followed by loud knocking. I threw on my robe and hurried downstairs, checking the security monitor before opening the door. Standing on my porch were 2 police officers, a woman in a business suit carrying a briefcase, and behind them, to my complete shock, stood Vivienne. "Mrs. Thornfield," said the older of the 2 officers. "I'm Sergeant Williams. We have a court order requiring you to allow access to this property for the purpose of recovering personal belongings." I stared at the official-looking document he held out to me. "I don't understand. What personal belongings?" The woman in the suit stepped forward. "Mrs. Thornfield, I'm attorney Sarah Blackwood, representing Mrs. Vivienne Thornfield. My client has legal documentation proving her ownership stake in this property, and she's here to collect her possessions and assert her residential rights." Behind her, Vivienne stood with an expression of cold triumph. She was dressed impeccably in a navy blue designer suit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed she held all the winning cards. "I'm going to need to see this court order," I said, reaching for the document. Sergeant Williams handed it to me, and I scanned it quickly. The legal language was dense, but the gist was clear. The court had granted a temporary order allowing Vivienne access to the property based on her claim of partial ownership, and her assertion that I was preventing her from retrieving her belongings. "This court order was obtained under false pretenses," I said firmly. "Mrs. Thornfield has no ownership stake in this property, and all of her belongings are in the guest wing, which she has access to." Attorney Blackwood smiled condescendingly. "Mrs. Thornfield, my client has documentation proving otherwise. She's also prepared to testify that you've been experiencing cognitive difficulties and that your son asked her to help manage your affairs." I felt a surge of rage at the implication. Where is my son? Does Theodore know about this? "Mr. Thornfield is aware of the situation," Vivienne spoke for the first time, her voice smooth and confident. "He's very concerned about your recent behavior and your apparent confusion about the ownership of this property. That's absolutely false. Theodore knows the truth about who owns this house." "Mrs. Thornfield," Sergeant Williams interjected, "we're not here to resolve ownership disputes. We're here to enforce a valid court order." Mrs. Vivienne Thornfield is entitled to enter the property and collect her belongings. If you have objections to the court's decision, you'll need to take that up with your attorney. I realized I was trapped. Fighting the court order would only make me look obstinate and possibly unstable. But allowing Vivienne into my house felt like letting a fox into the henhouse. Fine, I said. But I want to call my attorney first. And I want someone to document everything that happens here. That's your right, Attorney Blackwood said. But the court order must be enforced today. I stepped aside to let them in, my mind racing. How had Vivienne managed to get a court order so quickly? And how had she convinced a judge that she had a legitimate claim to my property? As they entered my living room, I noticed that Vivienne's eyes were already scanning the room with the same calculating look I had seen before. But this time there was something different in her expression, something that looked almost like ownership. I'll need to make some phone calls, I announced. Of course, said Sergeant Williams. But please understand that Mrs. Thornfield will be proceeding with her business while you do so. I went to my study and immediately called Harrison Walsh. When I explained what was happening, he was furious. Margaret, this is completely illegal. She can't get a court order based on fraudulent documents. But she did get one. It's signed by a judge. Which judge? I looked at the court order again. Judge Patricia Henley. There was a pause. Margaret, Judge Henley is semi-retired. She only handles emergency hearings and temporary orders. Vivienne must have convinced her that this was some kind of urgent situation requiring immediate intervention. What can we do? I'm going to file an emergency motion to vacate that court order, but it might take a few hours to get in front of a judge. In the meantime, document everything. Take photos. Make notes. Don't let her out of your sight. Harrison, I'm scared. There's something different about her today. She's acting like she actually owns this place. Margaret, be very careful. Don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, and don't let her intimidate you. I'll be there as soon as I can. When I returned to the living room, I found Vivienne directing the moving men like she was orchestrating a well-planned operation. They were already carrying boxes and furniture out of the guest wing, but I noticed they were also eyeing items in the main house. Excuse me, I said to one of the movers. What exactly are you here to collect? The man looked uncertain and glanced at Vivienne. She stepped forward smoothly. Margaret, as you know, Theodore and I have been living here for 3 years. During that time, we've accumulated quite a few possessions throughout the house. We're simply collecting what belongs to us. Everything in the main house belongs to me. Attorney Blackwood consulted her clipboard. Mrs. Thornfield, we have a detailed inventory of items that my client has identified as her property. Wedding gifts, furniture purchases, artwork, and various household items that were acquired during the marriage. I watched in horror as the movers began loading my antique dining room chairs onto their truck. Those chairs belonged to my grandmother. They've been in this house for 70 years. Actually, Vivienne said, pulling out a folder, I have receipts showing that Theodore and I purchased those chairs last year as an anniversary gift to you. Since they were a gift from us, we're entitled to reclaim them. She handed me what appeared to be a receipt from an antique store, dated 8 months ago, showing the purchase of 6 dining room chairs for $12,000. The receipt was made out to Theodore and Vivienne Thornfield. I stared at the document in disbelief. This is fake. These chairs have been in my family for generations. Margaret, I understand you might be confused about when certain items were acquired. Memory issues can make it difficult to keep track of these things. The condescension in her voice was infuriating. But what was even more infuriating was how prepared she was. She had fake receipts, fake documentation, and apparently a fake court order. This wasn't a desperate last-minute scheme. This was a carefully orchestrated plan that she had been working on for some time. I want to see proof that you have the right to take those chairs. Attorney Blackwood handed me another document. This is an affidavit signed by your son, Theodore Thornfield, attesting to the fact that he and his wife purchased those chairs as a gift for you, and that they are now reclaiming them due to your inability to properly care for such valuable antiques. I read the affidavit with growing horror. It was indeed signed with what appeared to be Theodore's signature, and it not only claimed ownership of the chairs but also stated that I had been showing signs of memory loss and confusion about my possessions. "This is forged," I said. "My son would never sign something like this." "Mrs. Thornfield," Sergeant Williams said gently, "these appear to be valid legal documents. If you believe they're fraudulent, you'll need to prove that in court." I tried calling Theodore, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I tried his office, but his secretary said he had called in sick and wasn't expected in that day. Over the next 2 hours, I watched helplessly as Vivienne systematically stripped my house of valuable items. She took the antique grandfather clock, claiming she had receipts showing it was a wedding gift from her parents. She took several pieces of artwork, claiming Theodore had purchased them as investments. She even took my grandmother's china cabinet, producing a fake appraisal document that supposedly showed Theodore had inherited it from his father. Each time I protested, she had documentation to back up her claims. And each time I demanded to speak to Theodore, I was told he was unavailable but had given his written consent for everything that was happening. "Where is my son?" I finally demanded. "I want to see him in person." "Theodore is at a medical appointment," Attorney Blackwood said smoothly. "He's been under a great deal of stress lately, due to concerns about your mental health. His doctor recommended he take some time to focus on his own well-being." "What kind of medical appointment?" "That's confidential information, Mrs. Thornfield." By noon, they had loaded approximately $50,000 worth of my belongings onto their truck. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what Vivienne did next. She walked over to my mantelpiece and picked up the small wooden box where I kept important documents. Inside that box were spare keys to the house, backup copies of insurance policies, and other critical paperwork. "I'll need these keys," she said, pocketing them before I could react. "Those are my keys to my house?" "Actually, Margaret, according to the court order, I'm entitled to access this property as a part owner. These keys will allow me to come and go as needed to continue managing the estate." "You are not a part owner of this property." Attorney Blackwood consulted her briefcase again and pulled out yet another document. "Mrs. Thornfield, this is a quitclaim deed showing that you transferred 50% ownership of this property to your son Theodore 3 months ago. Since Theodore is currently incapacitated due to medical issues, his wife has power of attorney to act on his behalf." I stared at the document she handed me. It appeared to show my signature transferring half the house to Theodore, with Vivienne listed as his attorney in fact. "I never signed this document. This is completely fraudulent." "Mrs. Thornfield, that's a very serious accusation. Are you claiming that your own signature has been forged?" I looked more closely at the signature on the deed. It did look remarkably like my handwriting, but I knew with absolute certainty that I had never signed any such document. "Yes, I am claiming that this signature has been forged." "Well, then you'll need to prove that in court. In the meantime, this deed is filed with the county recorder's office and is legally binding." I felt like I was in some kind of nightmare. Every document I challenged turned out to be officially filed somewhere. Every claim I disputed was backed up with seemingly legitimate paperwork. Vivienne had created an entire alternate reality on paper, and she was using the legal system to make that false reality binding. "I want everyone out of my house right now," I said firmly. "Actually, Margaret," Vivienne said, her mask of politeness finally slipping, "this isn't just your house anymore. According to the quitclaim deed, I have as much right to be here as you do. Get out." "I don't think so." Vivienne walked over to my favorite armchair and sat down with an air of complete ownership. "You see, Margaret, you've been living in a fantasy for too long. You've been pretending that you're some kind of wealthy widow who can afford to maintain this estate on her own. But the truth is, you're just a confused old woman who can't even remember what she owns and what she doesn't. That is not true. Isn't it? Look around you, Margaret. Look at all the things I just proved belong to me and Theodore. Look at all the legal documents showing that you've been gradually transferring ownership of this property to your son. The evidence is overwhelming." I realized that Vivienne had been planning this for much longer than I had suspected. She hadn't just forged a few documents when her original plan fell apart. She had been systematically creating a paper trail for months, maybe even years, that would support her claim to my property. The real documents are in my attorney's office, I said. The authentic property deeds, the real will, the actual financial records. When we get in front of a judge, the truth will come out. Vivienne smiled coldly. Margaret, by the time you get in front of a judge, it won't matter. You see, I've been very busy over the past few days. I've filed petitions with the court requesting a conservatorship hearing based on your obvious mental incompetence. I've submitted medical reports documenting your memory loss and confusion. I've provided evidence of your erratic behavior and your inability to manage your own affairs. What medical reports? I haven't seen any doctors. Well, that's part of the problem, isn't it? You've been refusing medical care, which is just more evidence of your deteriorating mental state. Attorney Blackwood opened her briefcase again. Mrs. Thornfield, I have here a petition for emergency conservatorship that will be heard tomorrow morning. Given the evidence we've compiled, it's likely that the court will appoint Theodore as your conservator, with Vivienne acting as co-conservator and manager of your affairs. The full scope of Vivienne's plan was becoming clear. She wasn't just trying to steal my house. She was trying to have me declared incompetent so that she could gain legal control over all of my assets. You won't get away with this, I said quietly. Actually, Margaret, I think I will. You see, I've been very careful to document every aspect of your declining mental state. Your confusion about property ownership, your paranoid accusations about forged documents, your inability to remember recent transactions and agreements. Any objective observer would conclude that you're suffering from dementia or some other cognitive impairment. She stood up from my chair and walked over to me, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. And the beautiful thing is, the more you fight this, the crazier you look. Every time you claim that a legitimate document is forged, every time you insist that you own things that clearly belong to other people, every time you make wild accusations about conspiracies and fraud, you just prove my point about your mental incompetence. I stared at her, finally understanding the full brilliance and evil of what she had done. She had created a scenario where the truth would sound like the ravings of a confused old woman, while her lies were backed up by official-looking documentation. Where is Theodore? I asked again. Theodore is exactly where he needs to be, Vivienne replied. Don't worry about Theodore. Worry about yourself and what's going to happen to you when the court declares you incompetent tomorrow. After they left, I sat in my living room surrounded by empty spaces where my furniture used to be. The antique grandfather clock was gone, leaving a pale rectangle on the wallpaper where it had stood for decades. The dining room looked cavernous without my grandmother's chairs and china cabinet. Even some of the family photos had been taken, with Vivienne claiming they were pictures of Theodore that belonged to him. I tried calling Theodore again, but his phone was still going to voicemail. I tried calling his office again, but his secretary now claimed she didn't know when he would be back. Something had happened to Theodore. I was certain of it. Whether he was being held somewhere against his will or whether he was genuinely incapacitated, I didn't know. But I was sure that he wasn't willingly participating in this scheme. I called Harrison Walsh and told him about the conservatorship hearing scheduled for the next morning. Margaret, this is extremely serious. If they succeed in having you declared incompetent, they'll have control over all of your assets. They could force you into a nursing home, sell your property, liquidate your investments, everything. Harrison, I need you to find Theodore. Something has happened to him. He would never allow this to happen if he were free to stop it. I'll hire a private investigator immediately. But Margaret, we need to focus on tomorrow's hearing. This is our chance to expose all of Vivienne's lies and present the real evidence. What if the judge doesn't believe us? What if all of Vivienne's fake documents convince the court that I really am incompetent? Then you could lose everything. That evening, I sat in my study preparing for the fight of my life. I gathered every piece of authentic documentation I had, every bank statement, every tax record, every piece of evidence that proved my competency and my ownership of the property. But as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that Vivienne was still one step ahead of me. She had been planning this for so long, had been so thorough in creating her false documentation, that I wondered if the truth would be enough to overcome her lies. At around 10 o'clock, I heard a car pull into my driveway. Through the window, I could see it was Harrison Walsh, but he wasn't alone. There was another man with him, someone I didn't recognize. I met them at the door, and Harrison quickly introduced his companion. Margaret, this is Detective Ray Martinez. He's been investigating some irregularities in court filings related to your case. Detective Martinez was a tall, serious-looking man in his 50s, with graying hair and sharp eyes. Mrs. Thornfield, I understand you've been the victim of an elaborate fraud scheme? That's correct. Well, I have some information that might interest you. We've been tracking a pattern of similar cases involving forged documents, fake medical reports, and fraudulent conservatorship petitions. Your daughter-in-law appears to be part of a larger criminal organization that specializes in targeting elderly property owners. I stared at him in shock. You mean she's done this before? Multiple times. She and her associates identify elderly people with valuable assets, then use various schemes to gain control of their property and finances. Sometimes they marry into the family, like she did with your son. Sometimes they pose as caregivers or financial advisors, but the end result is always the same. What happened to the other victims? Detective Martinez's expression darkened. Some of them lost everything. Some of them ended up in nursing homes against their will. And some of them... He paused. Some of them died under suspicious circumstances. A chill ran down my spine. Are you saying Vivienne might try to hurt me? I'm saying that people who have invested this much time and effort in a criminal scheme don't usually give up easily. And when their schemes are exposed, they sometimes become desperate. Harrison leaned forward. Ray, what about Theodore? Margaret is convinced that something has happened to her son. We've been looking into that. Theodore Thornfield was admitted to a private psychiatric facility 3 days ago, apparently suffering from a severe mental breakdown. The admission was arranged by his wife, who provided documentation showing that he had been having paranoid delusions and suicidal thoughts. That's impossible, I said. Theodore was fine when I saw him last week. Mrs. Thornfield, the facility where he's being held specializes in treating patients who are supposedly a danger to themselves or others. Getting someone released from there requires a court order, which can take weeks to obtain. So Vivienne has essentially had Theodore imprisoned while she carries out her plan. That appears to be the case. But here's the good news. We have enough evidence to arrest Vivienne and her associates tomorrow morning, right before your conservatorship hearing. What kind of evidence? Detective Martinez opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. We have proof that the medical reports she submitted about your supposed mental incompetence were written by a doctor who lost his license 3 years ago. We have evidence that several of the documents she filed with the court were created using the same computer and printer. And most importantly, we have testimony from other victims who can identify her methods and her associates. Harrison smiled grimly. Margaret, tomorrow morning, instead of facing a conservatorship hearing, you're going to watch Vivienne get arrested for multiple felonies. What about all the things she took from my house today? We'll get it all back, Detective Martinez assured me. Everything she took will be considered evidence in the criminal case, and it will all be returned to you after the trial. I felt a surge of relief mixed with exhaustion. After weeks of feeling like I was fighting an invisible enemy, finally someone in authority believed me and was taking action. Detective Martinez, how did you know to investigate this case? Your attorney contacted the district attorney's office about the forged documents, and the prosecutor noticed similarities to other cases we've been tracking. When we dug deeper, we realized that Vivienne Thornfield is actually Vivienne Walsh, a career criminal with a long history of identity theft and financial fraud. She's been using a fake name? Multiple fake names, actually. She's been married 4 times under different identities, and each time she's targeted men with valuable assets or wealthy family members. I thought about Theodore, locked away in a psychiatric facility, probably confused and frightened, not understanding why his life had suddenly fallen apart. Detective, how soon can we get Theodore released? I've already contacted the facility and informed them that Mrs. Thornfield's authority to make medical decisions for her husband is fraudulent. They're required to release him immediately unless they can provide independent medical justification for holding him. So he could be home tonight? It's possible. I'll know more in a few hours. As Detective Martinez and Harrison prepared to leave, I walked them to the door. Detective, there's one thing I don't understand. How did Vivienne manage to forge my signature so convincingly? That quitclaim deed she showed me today looked exactly like my handwriting. Detective Martinez smiled. That's actually one of the pieces of evidence that's going to convict her. She didn't forge your signature, Mrs. Thornfield. She traced it. Traced it? She used samples of your real signature from documents she had access to, then used computer software to create templates that could be traced onto new documents. It's a sophisticated technique, but it leaves very specific forensic evidence that we can detect. So she's been planning this for a long time, at least 2 years, based on what we've found. She's been systematically collecting samples of your signature, your handwriting, and other personal information that she could use to create fraudulent documents. After they left, I sat in my empty living room and tried to process everything I had learned. Vivienne wasn't just a greedy daughter-in-law who had gotten carried away with a scheme to steal my house. She was a professional criminal who had targeted my family as part of a calculated plan to steal everything I owned. But more than that, she had destroyed my relationship with my son, traumatized him to the point where he was hospitalized, and come dangerously close to succeeding in her plan to have me declared incompetent and imprisoned in a nursing home. At around midnight, I heard another car in the driveway. This time, when I looked out the window, I saw Theodore getting out of the passenger side of a police car. He looked exhausted and confused, but he was walking on his own and appeared to be unharmed. I ran to the door and threw it open. Theodore saw me and immediately started crying. Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry. I don't know what happened. I don't remember signing any of those documents. I don't remember agreeing to any of this. I held him as he sobbed, this grown man who was my little boy, and I felt my heart breaking for what he had been through. Theodore, it's not your fault. She drugged you, didn't she? He nodded against my shoulder. The doctors at the facility found traces of benzodiazepines in my blood. She must have been putting something in my food or drinks for weeks. That's why I felt so confused and tired all the time. That's why I couldn't think clearly. She was drugging you so she could manipulate you into signing documents and make you appear mentally unstable. Mom, I remember bits and pieces of signing papers, but it was like I was in a fog. She kept telling me they were routine financial documents, insurance forms, things like that. I never read them carefully because I trusted her. She took advantage of your trust and your altered mental state to commit fraud. Theodore pulled back and looked at me with clear eyes for the first time in months. Mom, can you ever forgive me for what I put you through? Theodore, you were a victim too. There's nothing to forgive. But I said such terrible things to you. I accused you of lying, of being confused, of not being able to manage your own affairs. You said those things because you were being poisoned and manipulated by someone you trusted. The real Theodore, the son I raised, would never have treated me that way under normal circumstances. We sat up most of the night talking. Theodore told me about the gradual changes in his behavior and thinking over the past few months, changes he had attributed to work stress but which now seemed clearly related to being systematically drugged. He told me about waking up in the psychiatric facility with no clear memory of how he had gotten there, and about the terror he had felt when the staff told him he had been admitted because he was suicidal. Mom, I've never had suicidal thoughts in my life, but they had documentation supposedly signed by me saying that I was planning to harm myself and others. They kept me sedated for most of the 3 days I was there. She needed you out of the way while she executed the final phase of her plan. What was the final phase? I told him about the conservatorship hearing that had been scheduled for that morning, and about how close Vivienne had come to gaining legal control over all of my assets. If Detective Martinez hadn't intervened, she might have succeeded. Theodore shook his head in amazement. Mom, I married a monster. How did I not see it? Theodore, professional criminals are experts at deception. They know how to identify targets, how to gain trust, and how to manipulate people. You're not the first intelligent person to be fooled by someone like this. At around 6 in the morning, we heard sirens in the distance. Through the window, we could see police cars and unmarked vehicles surrounding a house about a mile away. Detective Martinez had told us that Vivienne was staying with associates, and apparently they had located her. My phone rang an hour later. It was Detective Martinez. Mrs. Thornfield, we've arrested Vivienne Walsh and 3 of her associates. We've also recovered most of the items that were taken from your house yesterday. You should have everything back within a few days. What charges is she facing? Multiple counts of fraud, forgery, identity theft, elder abuse, false imprisonment, and conspiracy. She's looking at 20 to 30 years in prison if convicted on all counts. What about the conservatorship hearing? Cancelled, obviously. The court has been notified that all of the petitions filed by Mrs. Walsh were fraudulent. After I hung up, Theodore and I sat on my back porch, watching the sunrise over the gardens. The fountain in the rose garden was sparkling in the early morning light, and the ancient oak trees that had sheltered 4 generations of Thornfields were beginning to show their fall colors. Mom, I want you to know that I understand now who really owns this house, and who has been taking care of it all these years. Theodore, this house belongs to both of us. It always has. When I die, it will be yours completely, just as your father intended. But until then, it's your home, and I'm just grateful that you're willing to share it with me. This house is meant to shelter family, Theodore. It always has been. What about Vivienne? What about our marriage? Theodore, your marriage was based on lies from the very beginning. Vivienne Walsh isn't even the person you thought you married. She's a career criminal who targeted you specifically because she thought you came from a wealthy family. I suppose I'll need to file for divorce. I think that would be wise. And I suppose I'll need to get some counseling to help me process all of this. That's probably a good idea, too. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of us processing the events of the past few weeks. Finally, Theodore spoke again. Mom, I want you to know that I've learned something important from all of this. What's that? I've learned that the most valuable thing in my life isn't money or property or status. It's family. It's having people who love you unconditionally, who stand by you when things get difficult, and who forgive you when you make mistakes. Theodore, you've always known that. You just forgot it for a while. I forgot it because someone made me forget it, but I'll never forget it again. 2 months later, Vivienne Walsh was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Theodore's divorce was finalized, and all of the fraudulent documents she had filed were officially vacated by the court. My house was restored to its original condition, with all of my belongings returned and the damage repaired. The dining room chairs were back in their proper places, the grandfather clock was ticking steadily in the hallway, and my grandmother's china cabinet was once again displaying the family heirlooms that had been passed down through generations. Theodore moved back into the main house temporarily, while he looked for a place of his own. We spent our evenings talking in the living room, rebuilding the relationship that Vivienne had nearly destroyed. He was seeing a therapist to help him deal with the trauma of being systematically drugged and manipulated, and he was slowly regaining his confidence and his sense of self. One evening, as we sat by the fireplace reading, Theodore looked up from his book. Mom, I have something I want to give you. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a legal document that I recognized immediately. It was a quitclaim deed transferring his inheritance rights in the house entirely to me. Theodore, you don't need to do this. Yes, I do. I want you to have absolute, unquestioned ownership of this property. I never want anyone to be able to use my inheritance rights as a way to threaten you or challenge your ownership. But this house is meant to be your inheritance. And someday it will be, when you decide to leave it to me. But until then, I want you to have complete security and peace of mind. I looked at the document, then at my son. Are you sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I signed the quitclaim deed, and Theodore had it notarized and filed with the county recorder's office. For the first time in my life, I was the sole, undisputed owner of the Thornfield estate. But more importantly, I had my son back. The real Theodore, the one I had raised, the one who valued family over money and truth over convenience. Vivienne had tried to steal my house, but she had almost stolen something much more valuable. my relationship with my child. In the end, justice was served, truth prevailed, and family was restored. The house that had sheltered 4 generations of Thornfields would continue to be a sanctuary for those who deserved its protection. And as for anyone who might think about trying to take what wasn't theirs, well, they could ask Vivienne Walsh how that worked out for her. From her prison cell, she would have plenty of time to reflect on the consequences of underestimating Margaret Thornfield. The deed to my house bore my name, and only my name. And that's exactly how it was going to stay. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.